10 years ago, the heroine fled her engagement to the son of a powerful mafia boss after uncovering a plot to assassinate her father, a conspiracy hidden behind the arranged marriage. Unbeknownst to everyone, she was carrying the groom's child. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. The private jet touched down on the tarmac outside Palermo just as the sun bled orange across the Tyrrhenian Sea, and Elena Cassano felt her hands begin to shake before the wheels had even stopped rolling. 10 years. 10 years since she had left this soil in the middle of the night, with nothing but a stolen car, a burner phone, and a secret growing inside her that would change the shape of her entire life. Now she was back, dressed in black Armani, her dark hair pulled into a severe knot, her face arranged into the practiced calm of a woman who had learned, the hard way, how to hide everything that mattered. "Mummy, is that Nonno's island?" Matteo asked from the seat beside her, his nose pressed to the window, 9 years old and utterly unaware that the man he had never met, the man whose blood ran hot and unmistakable through his own veins, was waiting somewhere on that island for a family reunion that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with him at once. "That's Sicily, baby," Elena said, and made herself smile. "Your grandfather's home." She had told him 100 careful half-truths over the years, that his father had died before he was born, that there was no family on that side to speak of. Lies stacked on lies, each one a brick in a wall she had built to keep her son safe from a world that ate its young alive, a world of blood oaths and buried bodies, and men who settled disputes with bullets instead of words. She had not told him that his father was very much alive, and that in less than an hour she would be standing in the same room as him for the first time in a decade. The car that met them at the airstrip was long and black and driven by a man Elena didn't recognize, which told her everything about how much had changed and how much hadn't. Her father, Don Vittorio Cassano, had once employed the same 6 drivers for 15 years, running out of pure loyalty. Now there was a stranger behind the wheel, his jacket cut a little too well for a chauffeur, his eyes flicking to the rear-view mirror more often than necessary. "You're tense," Matteo observed, because children saw more than adults gave them credit for. "I'm excited," Elena lied, and looked out at the cypress trees blurring past the window, black fingers against a bruised violet sky. The Cassano estate rose out of the hillside like something built to withstand a siege, because in a way it had been. Stone walls 3 feet thick, a courtyard fountain that had been imported from a Roman villa 2 centuries ago, iron gates flanked by men in dark suits who did not smile as the car passed through. Elena's chest tightened, with a feeling that was not quite nostalgia and not quite dread, but some dangerous cousin of both. Her father was waiting on the front steps when the car pulled up, older than she remembered, silver now instead of black at his temples, but his eyes were the same, sharp, assessing, missing nothing. "Elena." He said her name like a man testing whether a bridge would hold his weight. "Papa." She stepped out of the car and let him embrace her, felt the tremor in his hands that hadn't been there 10 years ago, and understood in that moment that whatever illness had summoned this reunion was more serious than the family had let on over the phone. "And who is this handsome young man?" Vittorio asked, crouching stiffly to Matteo's level, his voice warming instantly. "I'm Matteo," her son said, offering his hand with the solemn formality Elena had drilled into him since he could talk. "It's nice to meet you, sir." Vittorio's eyes flicked up to Elena's face, and something passed between them. A question he did not ask aloud, not yet, not with staff and guards and cousins milling in the courtyard. But she saw the calculation happening behind his gaze, saw him doing the arithmetic of years and faces, and she knew, with the sick certainty of a woman watching a match drop toward dry grass, that she would not be able to keep her secret buried for long. Not here. Not surrounded by people who remembered exactly what Dante Moretti's eyes looked like, because Matteo had them. That same startling storm grey, the same unsettling stillness when he was thinking hard about something. "Come inside," Vittorio said finally, straightening, his hand finding Elena's shoulder, with a grip that was both welcome and warning. "The Morettis arrive within the hour. We should be ready to receive them." Elena's stomach dropped through the marble floor. "The Morettis," she repeated carefully, as though saying the name slowly might change its meaning. "All of them?" "It's Sophia's baby being baptized tomorrow," her father said, watching her face with an attention that made her want to look away. "Dante's niece. Of course the whole family is coming. Alessandro insisted on staying under our roof. Old habits, peace habits, from before." He paused. "Dante arrives tonight." Elena's pulse roared in her ears, loud enough to drown out the fountain, the birds, the low hum of security radios crackling somewhere near the gate. 10 years she had run. 10 years she had built a life in Boston under a name that wasn't quite hers. Raised a son who didn't know his own father's face. Told herself every single day that she had done the only thing a mother could do. And now the door was about to open, and on the other side of it stood the man she had never stopped loving and had never stopped fleeing, in equal, unbearable measure. "Matteo," she said quietly, crouching down to smooth his collar with hands that would not quite stay steady. "I need you to stay close to me tonight. Can you do that for me?" Her son studied her face with those grey eyes that were not hers, had never been hers, and nodded slowly, sensing without understanding that something enormous was coming. Somewhere beyond the gate, an engine growled low and expensive, drawing closer. Dante Moretti did not believe in ghosts. But when the car turned through the Cassano gates and the courtyard fountain came into view, lit gold against the darkening sky, he felt something cold move through his chest that could only be described as haunting. He had not set foot on this property in 10 years, not since the night everything had gone wrong. The night his bride had vanished from her own engagement dinner without a word, without a note, without so much as a single explanation, leaving behind a ring box on her untouched dinner plate and a silence that had nearly started a war between two families who had spent 3 decades trying not to kill each other. "You're quiet," his brother Marco said from the seat across the car, watching him with the particular amusement of a younger sibling who had spent a decade waiting for his older brother to show a crack in the granite. "I'm thinking," Dante said, "about her." Dante didn't answer, which was answer enough. Marco had the decency, for once, not to push. The truth was that Dante Moretti had spent the better part of a decade becoming a man his father could be proud of, and no one else could stand to be near for long. He had taken over half the family's legitimate holdings, the shipping company, the vineyards, the construction empire that laundered exactly as much as it built, and had done it with a coldness that his own men whispered about when they thought he couldn't hear. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. Men who crossed him simply disappeared from conversation, the way a name stops being said in a house after someone dies. He had not married. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, even come close. There had been women, of course, beautiful, disposable, forgotten by morning, but nothing that lasted longer than the time it took to remember he wasn't interested in whatever came after. His father had stopped asking about grandchildren years ago, after the third time Dante had answered the question with a silence so total it had ended the conversation for the rest of the evening. The car stopped in the courtyard. Dante stepped out first, as he always did, scanning the entrance with the automatic vigilance of a man who had buried 2 uncles and a cousin to violence, and did not intend to add himself to that list through carelessness. And then he saw her. She was standing at the top of the stone steps in a black dress that made her look like something carved rather than born, her hair different than he remembered, sleeker, more armoured, but her face exactly the same, that same fierce, guarded beauty that had ruined him for every other woman on earth a decade before he'd even understood what ruin meant. Elena Cassano. Elena, who had promised to marry him under a canopy of white roses and then vanished before the sun rose the next morning, leaving him to explain to 200 guests and a furious father why the bride had disappeared. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Then Dante's gaze slid, almost against his will, to the small boy standing half hidden behind her skirt, and the world tilted sideways on its axis. The boy had his eyes. Not similar, not coincidentally alike. His eyes, exactly. That same storm grey that his own mother had called the Moretti curse, because every man in his family carried it back 3 generations, unmistakable and unrepeatable by chance. Dante had looked into that particular shade of grey in mirrors his whole life. He was looking into it now, in a child's face, across a courtyard, 10 years after the woman standing beside that child had vanished from his life without a word. He felt something enormous and terrible click into place inside his chest. A lock turning. A door he had spent 10 years welding shut, swinging open, despite everything he'd done to keep it closed. Dante? Elena's voice, when it came, was steady in a way he recognized as effort rather than calm. It's good to see you. Elena. He made himself walk forward, made his face arrange itself into the polite mask that a decade of business had taught him to wear, over rage, over grief, over the particular fury of watching someone lie to your face with her chin lifted like she had every right to. You look well. So do you. The boy peered out from behind her, curious now that the tension in the air had resolved into something merely awkward instead of frightening. And Dante crouched, without entirely deciding to, bringing himself to the child's eye level the way he had seen his brother do with Sophia's older kids. "And who's this?" he asked, and his voice, to his own surprise, came out gentler than he'd used in years. "I'm Matteo," the boy said, offering his small hand with a formality that made something in Dante's chest crack clean down the middle. "It's nice to meet you, sir." "Matteo," Dante repeated, and looked up, past the child, into Elena's face, where he found something that had not been there a moment ago. Fear, raw and unguarded, the first honest thing he'd seen from her since the car door had opened. "How old is he?" Dante asked, and the courtyard, the fountain, the distant murmur of arriving guests, all of it fell away until there was only the question and the silence stretching taut around it, like wire pulled to its breaking point. Elena's throat worked once, twice, before she found her voice. 9, she said quietly. "He's 9 years old, Dante." 9 years. 10 months since the wedding that never happened, -1, carried away in secret across an ocean. Dante rose slowly to his full height, and when he looked at Elena now, the mask was gone entirely, and what remained underneath was something far more dangerous than anger, something that had been starving for 10 years and had just been shown, without warning, exactly what it had been denied. "We need to talk," he said. "Now." 10 years earlier. The night before her wedding, Elena Cassano couldn't sleep, so she wandered down to her father's study at 2 in the morning to steal a book from his shelves, the way she had as a girl, and instead she overheard the conversation that would end her life as she knew it. The study door was ajar. Her father's voice, low and controlled, the voice he used for business rather than family. And another voice, Salvatore Greco's, the family's most trusted advisor, the man who had brokered the alliance between the Cassanos and the Morettis, the man who had personally arranged every detail of Elena's engagement, down to the flowers on the tables. "The wedding proceeds as planned," Salvatore was saying. "Vittorio will be dead within the month. The Morettis will take the blame. Old grudges resurfacing. Everyone will believe it. No one questions a Mafia war restarting after a broken truce. By the time the dust settles, both families will be too busy burying their dead and burning each other's territory to notice who actually profits." "And the girl?" A third voice, unfamiliar, clipped, businesslike. "Married into the Moretti name by then. Ties her irrevocably to the family that will be blamed for her father's murder. She'll have no standing to fight for the empire. It falls to me, as executor, as it was always meant to." Elena had stood frozen in the hallway, one hand pressed over her own mouth to keep from making a sound, while the man who had raised her from a baby, who had taught her to ride a horse and told her stories about her mother, calmly discussed her father's assassination and her own manipulation as though arranging a dinner party. She hadn't waited to hear more. She had gone back to her room, packed a single bag with trembling hands, and by the time the sun rose over the villa, where 200 guests would soon gather to watch her marry Dante Moretti, she was already 3 hours gone, driving north with no plan beyond the desperate, animal certainty that she had to disappear completely, that she couldn't trust anyone, not her father's guards, who answered to men she no longer knew to trust, not the Morettis, whose blame was already being engineered before the wedding cake was even cut, and, God help her, not even Dante, because how could she know, in that panicked, sleepless hour, that he wasn't part of it too? She hadn't known then about the child. She found out 6 weeks later in a motel bathroom outside Cleveland, staring at a plastic stick with 2 pink lines, while her whole body shook with a fear that had nothing to do with pregnancy and everything to do with the knowledge that she was now carrying proof of a connection to the Moretti family that she could never, ever let become public, not without risking her son's life the same way her father's had been risked, not without handing Salvatore Greco a weapon he could use against everyone she loved. So she had done the only thing that made sense to a 23-year-old woman running for her life with a secret growing inside her. She had disappeared completely. New name, new city, a job answering phones for a law firm that eventually became a career, a small apartment that eventually became a home, a son who grew from a red, furious infant into a solemn, watchful boy with his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn heart. She had called her father exactly 4 times in 10 years from unlisted numbers, brief calls to confirm he was alive, and to tell him, without explanation, that she loved him and that she was safe. She had never told him why she'd run. She hadn't dared, not knowing who might be listening, not knowing if Salvatore Greco still sat at her father's right hand, trusted and untouchable, waiting for his moment. And he had. For 10 years, Salvatore Greco had remained exactly where he'd always been, the loyal family consigliere, present at every gathering, advising both dynasties with the same warm, avuncular smile he'd worn Elena's whole life, patient as a spider watching its web for the smallest tremor. Elena had told herself for 10 years that her silence was protection, that the less anyone knew, the safer they all were. She had built an entire life around that single, brittle belief. Now she was back on Sicilian soil, her son's grey eyes already recognised across a courtyard, and she understood with sick clarity that the wall she had spent a decade building was about to come down all at once, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Dante did not raise his voice. That was, Elena thought, somehow worse than if he had. He led her, not touched her, never quite touched her, though his hand hovered close to her elbow the entire walk, with the particular controlled restraint of a man who did not trust himself, through the villa's east wing to a small library that overlooked the sea, and shut the door behind them with a click that sounded, in the tense silence, like a gunshot. 9 years old, he said, without preamble, his back to her, staring out at the darkening water. Which means he was conceived before the wedding, before you disappeared. Yes, you knew. He turned then, and the look on his face was not what she'd expected, not fury, not yet, but something colder and more controlled, a man doing math he did not want to be doing. When you ran, you already knew you were carrying my child. No? Elena made herself meet his eyes, because she owed him this much honesty, even if she couldn't give him all of it. Not yet, not until she understood who else in this house might be listening. I found out 6 weeks after I left. I didn't know when I ran, Dante. I swear to you, I didn't know. But you knew for 9 years after that. 9 years, and you told me nothing, not a call, not a letter, nothing. His voice cracked finally on the last word, and it was the crack that undid her more than any shout could have. I mourned you, Eleanor. Do you understand that? I didn't know if you were alive for the first 2 years. I had men searching 3 continents, and the entire time you had my son. I was protecting him. The words came out raw, cracked open. I was protecting both of us. Protecting us from what? Now the anger came, sharp and sudden, though he kept his voice low, a discipline she remembered from a decade ago. Dante Moretti never lost control in a room where the walls might have ears. From me? From my family? What did you think I would do, Eleanor? Hurt you? Hurt a child? I didn't run from you. The confession tore loose before she could stop it, 10 years of pressure behind it. I ran because I overheard Salvatore Greco planning my father's assassination the night before our wedding. He said the Morettis would take the blame. He said it was already arranged, that by the time anyone figured out the truth, both families would be burning each other's territory to the ground, and he'd be the only one left standing to inherit what remained. The silence that followed was absolute. Dante's face had gone very still, the particular stillness she remembered from their courtship, the stillness that meant he was thinking faster and more dangerously than his expression let on. Salvatore, he said finally, testing the name like it might be a trap. Salvatore Greco. I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know if you were part of it. God, Dante, I need you to understand. I was 23, and I heard the man who raised me plotting my father's murder, and I didn't know if the wedding itself was part of the plan, if the Morettis knew, if anyone was safe. So I ran to the only place I could think of where no one would look. Nowhere. I became no one. I had to. If Salvatore had known I was carrying your child, if he'd realized there was a living connection between our two families that he couldn't control, he would have used Matteo the same way he tried to use our marriage. Or worse. Dante crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped the back of a chair so hard she heard the wood creak. 10 years, he said, low, furious, aimed as much at himself as at her. 10 years Salvatore has sat at your father's table, at my father's table, advising us both. I have shaken that man's hand 100 times. I let him near my nephews, my nieces. He looked up, and the fury in his eyes had a new target now, one that made Elena's blood run cold. He's here, Elena. Tonight. He arrived with my father's delegation an hour ago. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. He's here? In this house, under this roof, with your son. Dante was already moving toward the door, his phone in his hand, his voice dropping into the flat, commanding register she remembered him using with his men a decade ago, back when she'd first understood exactly what kind of family she was marrying into. Marco, get eyes on Salvatore Greco. Do not let him near the Cassano boy. Do not let him know we're watching. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed him into the hallway. Every instinct she'd spent 10 years honing, screaming that the wall around her carefully built life had just been blown apart in a single conversation. And somewhere beneath the terror, treacherous and undeniable, was the realization that for the first time in a decade, she was not facing this alone. Matteo was in the grand salon with 3 of his newfound Moretti cousins, teaching them a card game he'd learned at school, utterly unaware that his mother had just detonated a decade-old secret 2 rooms away. Elena stood in the doorway and watched him laugh at something Marco's daughter said, his whole small face lit up with the particular joy of a child who has just found people his own age to play with, and felt her chest ache with a love so fierce it bordered on violence. "He's beautiful," Dante said quietly beside her, and she startled, not having heard him approach. His anger had banked itself somewhere beneath the surface, controlled now, but she could feel it radiating off him like heat from a stove. "He likes puzzles," Elena said, because it was easier than anything else she might have said. "And dinosaurs. He wanted to be a paleontologist for 2 years, and now he wants to be an architect, because he watched a documentary about bridges." He has your stubbornness. Dante's mouth curved, almost involuntarily, into something that wasn't quite a smile. And my mother's chin. Elena's throat tightened. She had not expected tenderness. She had braced for rage, for accusation, for the particular icy fury she remembered him capable of. And instead, he stood beside her in a doorway, watching their son, with an expression that looked horribly, achingly, like grief for years he could never get back. "Where's Salvatore now?" she asked, because if she didn't change the subject, she was going to fall apart in this hallway, and there was no time for that. "Marco has him occupied in the west drawing room with my father and 3 glasses of very expensive wine." Dante's jaw tightened. "He doesn't know we suspect anything. He's playing the same role he's played for 30 years, the wise old advisor, indispensable to both families. I need you to think very carefully, Elena. 10 years ago, who else was in that hallway? Who else could have heard what you heard, or could corroborate it?" "No one. I was alone. It was 2 in the morning." "Then it's your word against his." Dante's expression darkened. A word he'll dismiss as the delusion of a runaway bride trying to justify abandoning her family for a decade. He'll paint you as unstable, ungrateful. He'll use Matteo against you, claim you kept the boy from me out of spite, out of scheming for a bigger settlement. He's had 10 years to prepare a story if this day ever came, Elena. Men like Salvatore always have a version ready. The clarity of it, the cold, strategic precision, reminded her sharply of exactly why the Moretti family had survived 3 decades of mafia politics without losing its footing once. Whatever Dante had become in the years she'd been gone, he had become dangerous in exactly the way his father had always intended. So what do? We don't accuse him of anything. Not yet. Dante's eyes tracked back to the salon, to Matteo laughing over a hand of cards, and something in his face hardened into resolve. We watch him. We find proof, financial records, communications, anything that connects him to the men who would have carried out your father's assassination 10 years ago. If he engineered it once, he'll have left traces, even buried ones. Men like him always believe they're too clever to be caught, which makes them careless in exactly the ways that matter. And Matteo? Matteo doesn't leave your side, or mine, until this is finished. Dante turned to look at her fully then, and the weight of his gaze felt like something physical, pinning her in place. I am not losing another decade with my son because I failed to protect him, Elena. Whatever else happens between us, whatever you owe me in explanations, and you owe me a great many, that boy is safe first. Everything else comes after. I know. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. I've spent 10 years making sure of it alone. I don't know how to do it any other way. You're not alone anymore. The words landed between them with a finality that made her chest ache. Whatever I feel about the lie you told me, and I feel a great deal about it, Elena, more than I think you're prepared for. He is my son. That doesn't get negotiated. That doesn't get hidden again. Are we understood? She met his eyes and saw, beneath the anger, beneath the wounded pride of a man who had spent 10 years grieving a woman who wasn't dead, something that terrified her more than Salvatore Greco ever could. The unmistakable, unextinguished truth that Dante Moretti had never stopped loving her, not for a single day, and that loving her again, fully, dangerously, was no longer a choice either of them could avoid making. "Understood," she whispered. Across the room, Matteo looked up, caught her eye, and grinned. A wide, gap-toothed, entirely unguarded grin that was, achingly, entirely his father's. Dinner that night was a performance of civility so precise it could have been choreographed, and, in a sense, Eleanor thought, it had been. 30 years of practice at smiling across a table at people you might one day have to bury. Salvatore Greco sat near the head of the table, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, exactly as she remembered him, laughing warmly at something Alessandro Moretti said, patting Vittorio's arm with the easy familiarity of a man who had never once doubted his own welcome in this house. Watching him, Eleanor felt something twist violently in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but a kind of vertigo, the specific horror of looking at a familiar face and seeing, for the first time, the monster that had been hiding behind it for 30 years. Eleanor. Salvatore's attention turned to her partway through the second course, his smile widening with what looked sickeningly like genuine affection. 10 years, cara. You look wonderful. Motherhood suits you. Thank you, Salvatore. She made herself smile back, made her voice light, though every instinct screamed at her to put the length of the table between them. It's good to see you too. And this must be the young man everyone's been talking about. Salvatore's gaze slid to Matteo, seated between Elena and Dante, a placement Dante had engineered without discussion, a wordless wall of protection that Elena had noted and been grateful for. 9 years old, I hear. Handsome boy. Thank you, sir, Matteo said politely, and Elena watched Dante's hand tighten, almost imperceptibly, around his wineglass. You have your father's eyes, Salvatore continued, and something in his tone shifted just slightly, a note of calculation beneath the warmth that made the hair on Elena's arms rise. Remarkable, really. I don't think I've ever seen the Moretti colouring passed down so purely. The table had gone quiet. Vittorio's jaw was tight. Alessandro Moretti's eyes had narrowed, doing the same arithmetic his son had done in the courtyard hours earlier. Elena felt the moment stretch and thin, felt every eye at the table swing toward her and Dante, waiting for the confirmation no one had yet spoken aloud. He does, Dante said, calm and final, and reached over to rest his hand briefly, deliberately, on Matteo's shoulder. A claim staked in front of both families without a single raised voice. He's my son. The murmur that ran down the table was immediate and electric. Alessandro set down his fork with exaggerated care, his expression unreadable. Vittorio closed his eyes briefly, and Elena couldn't tell if what crossed his face was grief or relief, or both at once. Well, Salvatore's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went very still, very cold, in a way that made Elena's pulse spike. What wonderful news! A grandchild none of us knew we had. You must tell us everything, cara. Where you've been all these years. Why you never thought to share such joyous news with the families who love you. It's a long story, Elena said, keeping her voice light with an effort that cost her everything she had. One for another time, perhaps. Of course. Salvatore's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than comfortable before sliding away, back to Alessandro, back to easy conversation about the baptism ceremony planned for tomorrow, as though nothing had happened at all. But Elena had seen it. The flicker of calculation, quickly hidden, the recognition that the man across the table had known exactly what she looked like 10 years ago, and understood, in the space of a single sentence, precisely what her secret had cost to keep, and precisely what it might now be worth to expose. Later, in the corridor outside the dining room, Dante caught her wrist, the first time he had touched her since she'd arrived, and pulled her into the shadow of an alcove, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "He knows we suspect something. He's always known how to read a room." Elena's whole body was still thrumming with adrenaline. "Dante, the way he looked at Matteo." "I saw it." Dante's grip on her wrist gentled, though he didn't let go, and the warmth of his hand against her skin sent an unwelcome, electric awareness through her entire body, a decade-old current flickering back to life despite everything. "We need to move faster than I wanted to. If he thinks Matteo is a liability to whatever he's still building, he won't hesitate. Men like Salvatore don't do sentiment." "What do we do?" "Tonight, nothing changes. Matteo sleeps in the room beside mine, not yours. I'll have 2 of my men outside the door. Tomorrow, during the baptism, everyone's guard will be down, distracted by the ceremony. That's when Salvatore will make his move, if he's going to make one at all. Chaos, crowds, an easy moment to disappear a threat." "You think he'd hurt a child?" Elena's voice cracked on the words, the reality of what they were discussing crashing over her all at once. Dante's face, in the low light of the alcove, was carved from something harder than granite. "I think," he said quietly, "that Salvatore Greco has already proven he's willing to burn 2 families to the ground to inherit what isn't his. I am not going to underestimate what he'll do next, and neither should you." Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in the guest room that had once, briefly, a lifetime ago, been decorated as a bridal suite, and stared at the ceiling while the sea murmured against the rocks below the villa, and eventually gave up entirely and wandered out onto the terrace at 1 in the morning, wrapped in a robe against the cool night air. She wasn't surprised somehow to find Dante already there, leaning against the stone balustrade, a glass of something amber untouched in his hand, staring out at the black water. "Can't sleep either," she said, more statement than question. "I haven't slept well in 10 years. He didn't look at her, but he didn't tell her to leave either, and she took that as invitation enough to cross the terrace and stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off his body in the cool night air. "I used to think it would get easier. Every year I told myself the next one would be the one where I stopped thinking about you every time I walked into a room. Dante, I'm not finished." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, a decade of restraint finally cracking. "I searched for you for 2 years. Did you know that? I had men in every major American city. I hired investigators who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. I told myself it was about the insult to my family, the humiliation of a bride vanishing from her own wedding. And for a while, I even believed that lie, because it was easier than admitting the truth." "What was the truth?" she asked, though some part of her already knew, had known for 10 years, had built her entire self-protective silence around the fear of what admitting it might cost them both. That I loved you. He turned to face her then, and in the moonlight his eyes looked almost silver, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen since the night he'd proposed to her in his family's vineyard, down on one knee among the vines, laughing at his own nervousness. That I had loved you since we were 19 years old, and our fathers first put us in a room together and told us to get acquainted. And I had spent 2 years falling in love with you against every instinct that told me not to trust an arranged match. And by the time you disappeared, I wasn't marrying you out of duty anymore. I was marrying you because I couldn't imagine my life any other way. Elena's eyes burned, tears she'd held back for a decade, threatening to finally break loose. I loved you too, she whispered. That's the part I never let myself say out loud all these years, not to Matteo, not to anyone. That running from you wasn't running from a marriage I didn't want. It was running from a marriage I wanted more than anything, because I thought loving you might get us both killed. You should have told me. His voice cracked, raw with a decade of grief finally given voice. Whatever you overheard, whatever you feared, you should have come to me, Elena. I would have protected you. I would have protected our son. I was 23, and I heard the man who raised me discussing my father's murder like a business transaction. The words came out in a rush now, the dam finally breaking. I didn't know if you were part of it. I didn't know if your father knew. I didn't know anything except that I was terrified and alone, and the only person I trusted completely was the same person who was planning to have my father killed. What was I supposed to do, Dante? Trust blindly and hope I guessed right? No. He set the glass down on the balustrade with a sharp click and closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contradicted every hard, controlled line of his body. You were supposed to survive. And you did. You kept our son alive and safe for 10 years, alone, with no one to help you, no family, no money that wasn't earned by your own hands. I am angry, Elena. God, I am so angry. I don't even know how to hold all of it. But I am not going to stand here and tell you that you were wrong to survive. His thumb brushed against her cheekbone, catching a tear she hadn't realized had fallen, and the tenderness of the gesture, after the fury of the day, undid something in her chest that she'd kept locked tight for 10 years. I missed you every day, she admitted, the words scraping raw on their way out. Every single day, Dante. I built a whole life out of missing you, and I never let myself say it. Not even to myself, because saying it made it real, and I couldn't afford for it to be real. I had a son to protect. You're not protecting him alone anymore. His forehead dropped to rest against hers, close enough that she could feel his breath, warm and unsteady, against her lips. Whatever happens with Salvatore, whatever this costs either of us, I am not letting you walk away again. Not from me, not from him. I've lost 10 years I can't get back. I won't lose any more. The space between them had narrowed to almost nothing, his hands still cradling her face, her own hands rising, almost without permission, to grip the front of his shirt, And for one suspended, breathless moment, it seemed as though a decade of grief and longing might finally resolve itself into something as simple as a kiss. Then, somewhere below them in the courtyard, a car door slammed, and the moment shattered like glass. The baptism was held in the small stone chapel on the eastern edge of the estate grounds, a building older than either family's presence on the island, its walls hung with faded frescoes and its air thick with incense and candle smoke. Elena sat in the third pew, with Matteo pressed against her side, watching Sophia and her husband carry their infant daughter to the font, while 100 relatives and associates from 2 Mafia dynasties crowded the small space in their finest black and gold. She had barely slept. The moment on the terrace hung between her and Dante like something unresolved, a held breath neither of them had released, and she found her eyes drifting to him constantly throughout the ceremony. Standing near the front beside his father, his jaw tight, his gaze sweeping the room every few minutes in the automatic vigilance of a man who had spent the entire night, she suspected, exactly as sleepless as she had. Salvatore Greco stood 3 rows back, dressed immaculately, singing the hymns in a clear, confident tenor, the picture of a beloved family elder. Elena watched him from the corner of her eye and felt her skin crawl with the specific horror of proximity to danger disguised as warmth. "Mummy," Matteo whispered, tugging her sleeve, "why is that man staring at us?" Her blood ran cold. She followed her son's gaze and found Salvatore's eyes fixed directly on them, his expression unreadable. And when he realized he'd been noticed, he offered a warm, grandfatherly smile that did nothing to unclench the fear coiled in Elena's stomach. "He's just happy to meet you," she whispered back, and gripped Matteo's small hand tighter than she meant to. The ceremony concluded without incident, and the crowd began filing out into the courtyard, where a reception had been laid. Long tables draped in white linen, an army of caterers, champagne flowing before noon in the particular indulgent excess that Mafia families reserved for baptisms and weddings and, occasionally, funerals disguised as celebrations. Elena kept Matteo close, scanning the crowd with an alertness that made her temples ache. It was during the toasts, as Alessandro Moretti raised his glass to his newest grandchild, that Elena lost sight of Matteo for less than 90 seconds, turning to accept a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, turning back to find the space beside her empty. Her heart stopped. "Matteo?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended, cutting through the ambient chatter of the reception. Heads turned. "Matteo!" "He went that way, cara, with an older gentleman, I assumed a relative," said a woman Eleanor vaguely recognized as a Moretti cousin, gesturing toward the garden path that wound down toward the cliffs overlooking the sea. The world tilted. Eleanor was moving before she'd consciously decided to, shoving through the crowd, her heels catching on the gravel path, panic clawing up her throat as she rounded the hedge and saw, with a horror so absolute it felt like drowning, Salvatore Greco standing at the edge of the garden with his hand resting on Matteo's shoulder, the 2 of them alone at the top of a stone staircase that led down toward the rocky shore, 40 feet below. "Matteo!" Eleanor's scream tore out of her, raw and animal, and she saw Salvatore's head turn, saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt, but calculation, the look of a man recalculating odds in real time. "Elena!" His voice was warm, easy, utterly unbothered. "I was just showing your son the view. He was curious about the old lighthouse ruins." "Get away from him." She reached them in seconds, hauling Matteo against her body with a force that made him gasp, putting herself bodily between her son and the man who had, 10 years ago, calmly planned her father's murder, in a study 200 feet from where they now stood. "Elena, you're frightening the boy," Salvatore said, his tone gently chiding, as though she were the unreasonable one. "I've done nothing but step back from her." Dante's voice cracked across the garden like a whip, and Elena turned to see him striding down the path with 3 of his men flanking him, his face a mask of controlled, murderous fury. "Now, Salvatore." Salvatore raised both hands, palms out, the picture of wounded innocence. "I was simply admiring the view with a curious child. I don't understand this hostility." "You will," Dante said quietly, and something in his voice made even Salvatore's practiced calm falter just slightly, just for a moment, but long enough for Elena to see it and to understand, with a chill that settled deep into her bones, that whatever careful game the old man had been playing for 30 years, the pieces had just begun irreversibly to move. That night, once Matteo was finally asleep, exhausted, oblivious to how close disaster had come, tucked into the guest room beside Dante's, with 2 of his men posted silently outside the door, Dante called a meeting in his father's study that included only 4 people: himself, Elena, Vittorio Cassano, and Alessandro Moretti. "He's been stealing from both families for years," Dante said without preamble, sliding a folder across the desk toward the 2 older men. "I had my people pull his financial records the moment Elena told me what she overheard 10 years ago. Offshore accounts, shell companies registered in 3 countries, payments that trace back to men neither family has ever employed, mercenaries, the kind hired for exactly one purpose." Vittorio's face had gone grey as he flipped through the documents, his hands, Elena noticed with an ache in her chest, trembling more than they should for a man his age. 30 years, Alessandro said quietly, staring at nothing. 30 years. I trusted that man with everything. My sons, my territory, my life more than once. "He arranged the marriage between Elena and me specifically to consolidate power," Dante continued. "If Vittorio had been assassinated as planned 10 years ago, with the blame falling on our family, Elena would have been married into the Morettis, with no standing to inherit the Cassano empire. And as the trusted family executor, with decades of accumulated authority over both dynasties' finances, Salvatore would have been perfectly positioned to absorb what remained of both territories once the resulting war between our families destroyed what was left of either leadership structure." "He's still doing it," Elena said, and every eye in the room turned to her. "Today, in the garden, with Matteo. He wasn't showing my son a view, Dante. He was assessing him, the same way he assessed me 10 years ago. Matteo is a living connection between our 2 families now, publicly acknowledged in front of everyone at that baptism. If Salvatore's original plan required control of the Cassano-Moretti connection, then Matteo just became either his greatest asset or his greatest threat, depending on whether he can control the situation." "He can't control us," Dante said, low and fierce. "He doesn't need to control you," Vittorio said heavily, closing the folder. "He only needs to eliminate the people he can't control and replace them with people he can. That's always been his method. Small, deniable losses. A car accident, a hunting mishap, a sudden illness. He's a patient man. He's had 30 years of practice making inconvenient people disappear without ever raising a single alarm. The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over all four of them. "What do we do?" Alessandro asked finally, and Elena heard beneath the gravel of his voice genuine grief, the particular betrayal of a man realizing he had spent decades trusting a viper he'd invited willingly into his own house. "We can't simply kill him," Vittorio said, and Elena flinched slightly at the flat practicality of the statement, a reminder, if she'd needed one, of exactly what world she had returned to. Not without proof the families can present to the commission. Salvatore has spent 30 years cultivating relationships across every major territory on this coast. If we eliminate him without ironclad justification, half our allies will assume we've turned on each other again, and we'll have exactly the war he originally engineered, just 10 years late, and started by our own hands instead of his. "Then we need him to expose himself," Dante said slowly, and Elena watched an idea take shape behind his eyes, cold and precise. "He believes his secret is still safe. He doesn't know how much we've already found. If we can convince him that Matteo represents a genuine threat to his position, that the boy's existence is about to unravel everything he's built, he'll act. Men like Salvatore always overplay their hand when they feel cornered. We give him a moment of apparent opportunity, and we make sure every move he makes is witnessed." "You want to use my son as bait," Elena said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I want to use the appearance of an opportunity," Dante corrected, meeting her eyes steadily. "Matteo will never be in real danger, Elena. I promise you that on my life, on my family's name, on anything you need me to swear it on. But Salvatore needs to believe he has a clean shot at removing the threat Matteo represents. That's the only way we get him to act where we can catch him doing it." Elena looked around the room. Her father, aged and fragile in a way she hadn't fully let herself see until tonight. Alessandro, gutted by the betrayal of a man he'd trusted for 30 years. Dante, cold and controlled and utterly resolved, exactly the kind of dangerous she'd once run from and now, impossibly, found herself trusting completely. "If anything happens to him," she said quietly, "if there is even one moment where my son is genuinely at risk—" "There won't be." Dante crossed the room and took her hands in both of his, a gesture of such open tenderness in front of both fathers that Elena saw Vittorio's eyebrows lift in quiet surprise. "I failed to protect you both for 10 years without ever knowing it. I am not failing now. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs me. Matteo will be safe. I swear it." Elena searched his face for any hint of doubt, and found none. Only the same fierce, unshakable resolve she remembered from the boy who had knelt among the grapevines a decade ago and promised her forever, without knowing how badly that promise would be tested. "Then tell me the plan," she said. "All of it. I want to know every single detail before my son is anywhere near that man again." The plan required patience, which was, Elena thought, the cruelest part. 3 more days of smiling across dinner tables at Salvatore Greco. 3 more days of watching him charm the room with the same warmth he'd used to earn a lifetime of trust from 2 families he had spent 30 years quietly betraying. Dante had arranged everything with a precision that left no room for improvisation. A rumour, planted carefully through a cousin, known to talk too much after wine, that Elena intended to have Matteo's paternity legally established through a formal DNA test administered by an outside laboratory, a step that would make the boy's claim to both family fortunes irrefutable and permanent. Filed with lawyers, Salvatore would have no ability to influence or suppress. The rumour was designed to create urgency, to suggest a narrow window before the boy's legal standing became untouchable. Surveillance had been placed throughout the villa, cameras Dante's men installed with a discretion that spoke to considerable practice. Listening devices in the rooms where Salvatore was most likely to make calls he believed private. Two of Dante's most trusted men shadowed Matteo at all times, close enough to intervene instantly, but distant enough to preserve the illusion of an unguarded child. And through it all, something had shifted between Elena and Dante that neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both felt with a growing, undeniable gravity. Late-night conversations on the terrace that stretched for hours, his hand finding the small of her back without either of them quite deciding it should. The particular electric charge of two people who had once been engaged, once been in love, circling back toward each other after a decade of forced distance. "You're different," she told him on the second night, sitting beside him on a stone bench overlooking the moonlit water, close enough that their shoulders touched. Colder in some ways, but also... Also what? Gentler with him than I expected. She watched a smile tug at the corner of his mouth, unguarded in a way she rarely saw. The way you are with Matteo. I didn't know if that part of you would still be there after everything you had to become to survive this world. He makes it easy to be gentle. Dante's voice softened. I look at him and I see everything I might have been if I'd had a father who wasn't training me for war from the age of 6. I want better for him than what was built for me. So do I. Elena's throat tightened. That's why I ran, Dante. I know it doesn't excuse the years you lost, the years he lost not knowing you. But I need you to understand, everything I did because I wanted him to have a chance at an ordinary life. A life where his name wasn't a target, where he didn't grow up learning to check exits in every room the way I did, the way you clearly still do. I understand it better than I want to. He turned to face her fully, his expression open in a way that made her chest ache. I've spent 10 years hating you a little, Elena, if I'm honest, and loving you the entire time, without ever managing to stop, no matter how hard I tried to make myself. Both of those things were true at once. I don't know how to reconcile them completely, not yet. But I know that watching you with him these past 3 days, watching what kind of mother you became, what kind of woman you had to be to keep him safe alone, I understand you made the only choice available to a 23-year-old who trusted the wrong person and had no one else to turn to. Do you forgive me? The question came out smaller than she intended, more vulnerable than she'd let herself sound in a decade. I'm trying. His hand came up to cradle her jaw, thumb tracing along her cheekbone with a tenderness that made her breath catch. Give me time, Elena. Not because I doubt I want you. God, I have never doubted that, not for one single day in 10 years. But because forgiveness isn't a door you walk through once. It's something I have to keep choosing. Every day. Especially on the days the anger comes back. I need you to be patient with me, the way I'm trying to be patient with you. I can do that. Her hand rose to cover his where it rested against her face. "I've had a decade to practice patience. I can spend a little more of it on you." He laughed then, low and surprised, a sound she hadn't heard from him since they were young and unbroken, and hadn't yet learned what the world could take from people who loved each other in families like theirs. "I missed that sound," she admitted. "Your laugh. I used to think I imagined it, sometimes, in the years after, that I built you up into someone softer than you really were, just to survive missing you." "I'm not soft," he said, though the words came out warm rather than defensive. "But I was never that with you, not from the beginning. You always saw something in me nobody else bothered to look for." His forehead dropped to rest against hers, the same suspended, breathless closeness from the terrace 3 nights before. And this time, when his mouth found hers, there was no slammed car door to interrupt it, only the slow, aching, unbearably tender collision of two people who had spent a decade grieving each other and had finally, impossibly, found their way back. The kiss was nothing like the desperate, hungry kisses of their engagement a decade ago. It was slower than that, more deliberate, carrying the particular weight of everything they had both survived to reach this exact moment. His hand cradling the back of her neck, her fingers curling into the front of his shirt, the two of them breathing each other in as though 10 years of separation could be undone by a single, unhurried kiss beneath a Sicilian moon. When they finally broke apart, Dante rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily, and murmured, "10 years, and you still taste like the only thing I've ever wanted." "Don't say things like that," Elena whispered, though she was smiling, tears standing bright in her eyes. "Not until Salvatore is dealt with. I can't fall apart right now. I have to be strong for Matteo." "You don't have to be strong alone anymore," Dante said again, the same promise from the terrace, and this time she let herself believe it completely. The rumour did exactly what Dante had predicted. On the 4th night, Elena's phone rang at 11:30 with an unknown number, and when she answered, a woman's voice, one of Vittorio's household staff, a woman Elena had known since childhood, spoke in a rushed, frightened whisper. "Signora Elena, forgive me. I shouldn't be calling, but I overheard something in the kitchen tonight. Signor Greco was on the phone, very agitated, speaking about your son. He said something about a window closing, about needing to act before the lawyers arrived Monday. I don't know what it means, but I was frightened for the boy, and I thought you should know." Elena's blood turned to ice, even as her mind raced through the plan Dante had laid out 3 days earlier. The plan they had built specifically to draw Salvatore into exactly this kind of desperate action. She called Dante immediately, and within 10 minutes the villa's security apparatus, the surveillance Dante's men had spent days quietly installing, was fully activated. Every camera monitored, every exit watched. Matteo moved discreetly from his guest room to a windowless interior chamber deep in the villa's oldest wing. Guarded by 4 armed men, Elena trusted with her son's life, because Dante trusted them with his own. "He'll come tonight," Dante said, standing in the makeshift surveillance room they'd set up in an unused study, watching a bank of monitors with the flat, focused calm of a man who had planned for violence his entire life. "He believes the window is closing. He'll want to move before witnesses gather, before the household wakes." "And if he doesn't come alone?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight. "Then we'll know exactly who else he's been using for 30 years, and we'll take them all down together." Dante's jaw was hard, but his hand found hers in the dim light, steady and grounding. Eleanor, I need you to trust me completely tonight. Whatever you see happen, whatever it looks like in the moment, trust that I have accounted for it. Matteo is safe. You are safe. Tonight, we finish what Salvatore started 10 years ago. It was past 2 in the morning when the monitor showing the corridor outside Matteo's decoy room, the guest room he'd been moved out of hours earlier, left with a shape arranged beneath the blankets to suggest a sleeping child, flickered with movement. Salvatore Greco, moving with the silent, practiced ease of a man who had done this kind of work before, slipped past the 2 decoy guards Dante had deliberately stationed to appear inattentive, and let himself into the room with a key that should not have existed for a guest chamber, a key that told its own damning story about how long he had planned for exactly this kind of access. Elena's stomach lurched as she watched him approach the bed, watched him reach toward the shape beneath the blankets with something small and glinting in his hand. And then the lights in the room snapped on all at once, and Dante's voice, amplified through a hidden speaker, cut through the silence like a blade. "Looking for someone, Salvatore?" The old man froze, his hand still extended toward the empty bed, and on the monitor, Elena watched his face transform in real time, the warm, grandfatherly mask dissolving instantly into something cold and calculating, and, for the first time in 30 years, exposed. Dante moved into frame on the monitor, flanked by Alessandro and Vittorio, both fathers grim-faced and armed, and behind them 2 more of Dante's men sealed the only exit. "There's no child in that bed," Dante said, his voice carrying the particular icy calm that Elena had learned over the past 4 days meant he was closer to violence than his tone let on. "There hasn't been for hours, but we do have 30 years of financial records, 4 independent witnesses to tonight's conversation about a closing window, and now, thanks to your own key, which no legitimate guest of this house has ever needed, an attempted intrusion into a child's bedroom in the middle of the night, captured on camera from 6 different angles." "This is a misunderstanding," Salvatore began, his composure cracking audibly. "Don't." Vittorio's voice, when it came, was quieter than Dante's, but somehow more devastating. 30 years of betrayed friendship compressed into a single syllable. "Don't insult what remains of my respect for you by lying to my face one more time, Salvatore. I trusted you with my daughter's life. I trusted you with the succession of everything I built. And you have spent 30 years selling both families out from the inside, one small betrayal at a time, patient enough to wait a decade for a second chance at killing a child in his sleep." Salvatore's shoulders sagged, the last of his mask finally completely falling away. And what remained beneath it was not remorse, Elena saw with a chill, but something far colder. The flat, resigned calculation of a man realizing the game was finally, irreversibly, over. "You have no idea what I've built," Salvatore said quietly, and there was something almost pitying in his voice, as though he still believed even now, even caught with a knife in his hand over an empty bed, that he was the only one in the room clever enough to understand the true stakes. "Both of your families would have destroyed each other decades ago without me managing the peace between you. I have kept this fragile truce alive through sheer force of will for 30 years. And this is my thanks. A trap, staged like a common criminal." "You didn't keep the peace," Dante said, low and lethal. You engineered a war 10 years ago that would have killed Vittorio, destroyed my family's reputation, and left you standing over the wreckage of both dynasties as the only man left who understood how the pieces fit together. And when that plan failed, because a 23-year-old girl was smart enough to run, you waited. 10 years you waited, patient as a spider, until the exact same opportunity walked back through the front door in the form of my son. The room fell utterly silent, the truth finally spoken aloud, in full, undeniable, in front of the two men who had trusted Salvatore Greco with everything that mattered to them for 3 decades. They did not kill him. Elena had feared, watching the confrontation unfold on the monitors and later in person, that the volatile mixture of 2 furious mafia patriarchs and 30 years of betrayal might end in immediate, brutal violence. But Dante and Vittorio, working together with a coordination that spoke to a decade of separately learned restraint, chose instead the slower, more devastating punishment of exposure. Salvatore Greco was brought before the Regional Commission within the week, a gathering of the coast's most powerful families, convened at Alessandro Moretti's insistence, presented with a case built from 30 years of financial records, corroborated testimony, and the damning footage of an armed intrusion into a child's supposed bedroom in the dead of night. The evidence was, as Dante had promised, ironclad, irrefutable enough that no ally of Salvatore's, and there had been many, could raise a single credible objection. Elena did not attend the commission hearing itself. That world, even now, remained one she had no wish to re-enter more deeply than necessary, and Dante had agreed without argument that her place was with Matteo, far from a room full of men deciding the fate of a traitor, with the particular brutal efficiency of an organization that had survived a century by punishing betrayal absolutely. She learned the outcome from Dante himself 3 days later, on the same terrace where he had first kissed her. Salvatore Greco, stripped of every asset he had accumulated over 30 years of theft, banished permanently from the territories of both families and every allied territory besides, his name entered into a ledger of untouchables that would follow him for whatever remained of his life. Not death, but something Eleanor suspected he might, in time, come to consider worse: utter, complete irrelevance. The erasure of 30 years spent building himself into a man both families believed they couldn't survive without. He begged at the end, Dante told her quietly, staring out at the sea. Offered names, connections, favors he claimed could still be useful. No one moved to help him. 30 years of relationships, and in the end, not one man in that room was willing to spend a single favor on his behalf. "Do you feel better?" Elena asked, "now that it's over?" Dante considered the question with the same careful honesty he'd brought to every difficult conversation over the past week. "I feel relieved," he said finally. "Relieved that Matteo is safe, that your father is safe, that the truth is finally out in the open, where it can't be used as a weapon against any of us anymore. But better isn't quite the word. I lost 10 years with you and with my son because of that man's greed. No amount of commission justice gives those years back." "No," Elena agreed softly, "it doesn't. But maybe we don't have to spend the years we have left mourning the ones we lost." He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression, hope, cautious and unguarded, breaking through the last of the careful control he'd maintained through the entire ordeal, made her chest ache with a tenderness so complete it nearly undid her. "Elena." He crossed the terrace and took both her hands in his thumbs tracing slow circles over her knuckles. "I know we have things to work through. 10 years of separate lives don't disappear because a threat has been dealt with. But I don't want to spend one more day pretending I'm not completely, hopelessly in love with you. I never stopped, not for a single day in a decade. And watching you these past 2 weeks, watching you fight for our son with everything you had, watching you trust me enough to let me fight alongside you, I know, without any doubt, that I want to spend whatever years we have left making up for the ones we lost." "Dante, let me finish." His voice was steady, despite the vulnerability written plainly across his face. "I'm not asking you to marry me tonight. I know that's not fair to ask, not yet, not with everything still raw between us. But I am asking you to stay. Not to run again, not to disappear back into a life built on hiding from me. Stay, and let me be Matteo's father, the way I should have been able to be for the past 9 years. Stay, and let me love you the way I never stopped, even when I was furious with you, even when I thought I might hate you for what you'd hidden. Give us the chance neither of us got to have 10 years ago." Tears slipped down Elena's cheeks, and this time she made no effort to hide them. "I'm tired of running," she said. "I've been running for 10 years, Dante, and I am so tired. I want to stay. I want Matteo to grow up knowing his father, knowing his whole family, without the shadow of Salvatore hanging over any of us. I want to stop being afraid of what loving you might cost." "Then stay," he said simply, and drew her into his arms, and this time when he kissed her, there was nothing tentative or restrained in it at all, only 10 years of longing, finally, fully released. The weeks that followed unfolded with a strange, fragile domesticity that neither Elena nor Dante had expected to find possible, given everything that had come before. Matteo once told the truth, a careful, age-appropriate version, delivered by both his parents together on the terrace overlooking the sea, explaining that his father had always loved him, even though circumstances had kept them apart. That the danger which had separated them was now finally gone, had taken the news with the particular resilient grace of a child who had spent his whole life sensing there was a piece missing from his story without ever knowing its shape. "So you're really my dad," he said to Dante, testing the words with careful seriousness. "Not just a friend of Mummy's." "I'm really your dad," Dante confirmed, crouching to meet his eyes the way he had in the courtyard on that first disorienting night. "I've always been your dad, Matteo. I just didn't know you existed until I saw you standing behind your mother 2 weeks ago. I promise you, if I had known, I would have come to find you the very same day." "Were you sad, not knowing about me?" "Every day," Dante said, and something in his voice made Matteo's small face crumple, and then the boy launched himself forward into his father's arms with the total, unguarded trust of a child who had simply been waiting all along for someone to claim him. Elena watched the embrace, with tears streaming freely down her face, And when Dante looked up at her over their son's shoulder, his own eyes bright with emotion he made no effort to hide, she understood that whatever fear had driven her from this life a decade ago, she had finally, completely, come home to exactly where she was always meant to be. Vittorio's health, once the stress of Salvatore's betrayal had been resolved, began a slow, encouraging improvement, the family physician noting with some bemusement that stress had likely been compounding an underlying condition far more than anyone had realized, and that the sudden absence of a man who had spent 30 years quietly poisoning the household's peace of mind seemed to have a genuinely restorative effect. Elena spent long afternoons with her father on the villa's terrace, filling in 10 years of missing history in careful, healing conversation, watching him dote on the grandson he'd been robbed of knowing for nearly a decade. Alessandro Moretti, for his part, had thrown himself into welcoming Elena and Matteo with the fierce, overcompensating warmth of a man determined to make up for years lost to another man's treachery. Arranging a formal family dinner within the first month that included every Moretti cousin, aunt and grandchild Elena had ever met, all of them eager to fold Matteo into the sprawling, loud, affectionate chaos of a family he'd never known he had. "You're one of us now," Marco told Matteo cheerfully, ruffling his hair at that first dinner, "which means you have approximately 40 cousins to learn the names of and a family reputation to live down to. Good luck." "Ignore him," Dante said, though he was smiling, an expression Elena still hadn't grown used to seeing so freely on his face. "You have a family that loves you, Matteo. That's the only part that matters." Late one evening, 3 weeks after Salvatore's exposure, Dante found Elena on the terrace where so much of their reconciliation had unfolded, and knelt in front of her. Not with the nervous, boyish energy of their first engagement a decade ago, but with the steady, unshakable certainty of a man who had already survived losing her once and had no intention of ever risking it again. "I bought this ring 10 years ago," he said, opening a small velvet box to reveal a ring she recognized instantly. The same one she'd left behind on her untouched dinner plate the night she'd fled. Recovered, apparently, and kept all these years in some drawer or safe, a relic of a promise interrupted. "I never gave it away. I couldn't. Some part of me, even in the years I told myself I hated you, knew I would need it again someday." "Dante." Her voice broke on his name. "I'm not asking because of Matteo, or because our families expect it, or because it's convenient." His eyes held hers, unwavering. "I'm asking because I have loved you since I was 19 years old, and every single thing I have survived in the 10 years since, every loss, every cold, careful choice I made to become the kind of man who could protect the people I love. All of it was building toward this exact moment, whether I understood that or not." "Elena Cassano, will you finally let me give you this ring? Will you marry me, not because a war demanded it or a matchmaker engineered it, but because I choose you, completely, for the rest of whatever years we have?" Elena looked down at the ring that had waited a decade for this moment, then back up at the man kneeling in front of her. The same man, and utterly transformed, both true at once, and felt the last of the fear she'd carried for 10 years finally, completely release. "Yes," she whispered, and then, laughing through fresh tears, louder, surer, "Yes, Dante, 1,000 times yes." News of the engagement spread through both families within hours, and by the following evening, Alessandro had already begun making noise about a proper wedding, a real one this time, held in the open, with no secrets buried beneath the flowers. But Elena found in the days that followed her acceptance that a single shadow still lingered over her happiness, one that had nothing to do with Salvatore Greco and everything to do with the 10 years of grief she had never allowed herself to fully process. She had spent a decade being strong, being careful, being endlessly vigilant on behalf of a son who needed her to have no cracks at all. And now, with the immediate danger finally gone, all of that carefully suppressed grief began at last to surface. She found herself crying without warning in the middle of ordinary afternoons, folding Matteo's laundry, watching him play in the garden with his cousins, watching Dante teach him to sail a small boat off the estate's private dock. Not sad tears exactly, but something more complicated. The delayed mourning of 10 years spent alone that she had never allowed herself to feel, because feeling it would have meant admitting how much it hurt. "Talk to me," Dante said one evening, finding her on the terrace with tears on her face and no immediate crisis to explain them. And this time his voice held none of the urgency of the past weeks, only gentle concern. "I don't even know what's wrong," she admitted. "Everything is finally right. Salvatore is gone. You know about Matteo. We're getting married. And I keep crying anyway, over nothing, over folding laundry. And I don't understand why the relief isn't just relief." Dante sat beside her and pulled her against his chest, and she let herself sink into the warmth of him with a completeness she hadn't allowed herself in a decade. "You spent 10 years being strong because you had no other choice," he said quietly. "You didn't have the luxury of falling apart, not once, not for a single day, because there was no one else to catch Matteo if you did. Now there is. Now you have me and your father and my whole ridiculous family fighting over who gets to babysit next weekend. You don't have to carry all of it alone anymore. Maybe that's exactly why it's finally safe enough for the grief to surface. Because for the first time in 10 years, you're not the only thing standing between our son and disaster." Eleanor cried harder at that, but it felt different this time. Not the tight, controlled tears of a woman who couldn't afford to fall apart, but something looser, more complete. Grief finally given room to move through her instead of being locked away behind careful composure. "I missed so much," she whispered. "Not just for you, for me. I missed having someone to share the hard nights with, the fevers, the first day of school, all the small, terrifying moments of raising a child completely alone. I did it, and I'm proud that I did it, but God, Dante, I was so tired for so long, and I never let myself say that out loud to anyone." "Say it now," he murmured against her hair. "Say all of it. I'm not going anywhere. I have 10 years of listening to make up for." So she did. Talked for hours, that evening and many evenings after, about the fear and exhaustion and quiet, grinding loneliness of the decade she'd spent protecting their son alone, about motel bathrooms and law firm receptionist jobs and the particular terror of a sick child at 2 a.m. with no one else to call. Dante listened to all of it without flinching, without judgment, his arms around her the entire time, and somewhere in the telling, Elena felt the last of the wall she'd built around her heart a decade ago finally, completely, come down. "I love you," she told him, Somewhere past midnight, her voice hoarse from talking, from crying, from the particular exhausted peace of finally setting down a weight she'd carried alone for far too long. I don't think I ever stopped, not for one single day, even when I was terrified of what loving you might mean. I know, Dante said, and kissed her temple with a tenderness that had nothing to do with the cold, dangerous man the rest of the world believed him to be, and everything to do with the boy who had knelt among the grapevines a decade ago and meant every word of a promise he had spent 10 years trying to fulfill. I've always known. That's what made losing you the hardest thing I've ever survived. And it's what makes having you back the greatest gift I could have imagined. Below them, the sea murmured against the rocks, patient and eternal, indifferent to the wreckage and the healing both. And for the first time in a decade, Elena Cassano felt, completely and without reservation, safe. The wedding took place 6 months later, in early summer, in the same chapel where Matteo's cousin had been baptized, decorated now not with the sombre trappings of a family under threat, but with an abundance of white roses that Elena had specifically requested. A deliberate echo of the wedding that had never happened a decade before, reclaimed now on her own terms, with no secrets hiding beneath the flowers this time. The nightclub Dante's family owned in Palermo, a glittering marble-floored establishment called Il Fantasma that had, over the years, become as much a symbol of Moretti power as any of their legitimate businesses, hosted the reception, transformed for the evening into something closer to a fairy tale than a mafia celebration. Though the two things, Elena had come to understand, were never quite as separate in this world as she might once have hoped. She stood at the entrance of the club in her wedding dress, watching the crowd of both families dancing together beneath a canopy of hanging lights, and felt Dante's hand find the small of her back with the same possessive gentleness that had become so familiar over the past 6 months. Second thoughts? He murmured against her ear, teasing, though she caught the faint thread of genuine vulnerability beneath the humour. Even now, even after everything, some part of him still braced for her to disappear. Never, she said, turning to face him fully, resting her palm against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating steady and strong beneath her hand. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Across the dance floor, Matteo, resplendent in a small tuxedo that matched his father's, insisting with great seriousness that he needed to look official for the wedding, was attempting to teach 3 of his cousins a card trick, his laughter carrying clear and bright over the music, and Elena felt her chest fill with a happiness so complete it was almost unbearable. 10 years of careful, guarded survival finally giving way to something she had genuinely feared she might never get to have. Look at him, Dante said softly, following her gaze. He's happy, truly happy. I don't think I understood, until I watched him with his cousins tonight, exactly what we gave him by finally coming together. Not just a father, but an entire world of people who love him. You gave him that, Eleanor said. Your family welcomed him like he'd always belonged. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for that. You don't need to thank me for loving my own son. Dante's hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone with the reverent tenderness that still, after 6 months, made her breath catch every time. Eleanor, I want you to know something. These past 6 months, watching you heal, watching you finally let yourself be happy without waiting for the other blow to fall. They've been the best months of my entire life. Better than anything I imagined possible, even in the years before you left, when I still believed our marriage would simply be the natural continuation of a comfortable, arranged partnership. I didn't know back then what it could actually feel like to choose someone, to have them choose you back, completely, with nothing hidden between you. "I choose you," Elena said, "every single day. I plan to keep choosing you for the rest of my life." He kissed her then, slow and deep, uncaring of the small crowd of family members who whistled and cheered around them. And when they broke apart, breathless and laughing, Vittorio appeared at Elena's elbow, his own eyes bright with tears he made no effort to hide. "Your mother would have loved this," he said quietly, taking Elena's hand. "She always said you had too much fire in you to settle for a marriage arranged by other people's ambitions. I think in the end you proved her right. You found your way to exactly the marriage you were always meant to have, just by a much harder road than any of us would have chosen for you." "I wouldn't change the road," Elena said, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "It was hard, Papa. Harder than I can even fully explain. But it gave me Matteo, and it taught me exactly how strong I could be if I had to be. I don't regret the years, even the painful ones. I only regret that Dante lost them too, without ever having a choice in the matter." "Then we build the years ahead together," Dante said, drawing her back against his chest. "And we make sure no one ever takes another one from us again." Later that night, as the reception wound down and Matteo finally succumbed to exhausted sleep in his grandfather's arms, Dante led Elena out onto the club's private balcony, overlooking the lights of Palermo spread out below them like scattered stars. And there, beneath the sky finally free of the shadows that had haunted them both for a decade, he pulled her close and murmured against her hair the words that felt, finally, like the true beginning of everything. "Welcome home, Signora Moretti." Married life settled into a rhythm neither of them had dared hope for in the darkest days of their separation. Mornings spent with Matteo before school, evenings when Dante would return from the legitimate side of the family's shipping business to find Elena curled up in his study with a book. Weekends given over entirely to the boisterous, sprawling chaos of Moretti family gatherings that seemed to expand by 2 or 3 cousins every month. But Elena had not spent a decade surviving on instinct without retaining a healthy wariness of how quickly peace could be shattered in this world. And 6 months into the marriage, that wariness proved, once again, well-founded. It began with a phone call Dante took privately in his study, his face darkening as he listened, and when he emerged 20 minutes later, Elena knew before he said a word that something had shifted. "Salvatore," he said grimly, confirming her fear. "He's resurfaced. Not here, he wouldn't dare, not after the Commission's ruling. But he's been seen in Marseille, meeting with a rival family that's been pushing at our territory's edges for the past year. He's offering them information, old records, old contacts, 30 years of accumulated knowledge about how both our families operate, sold to the highest bidder now that he has nothing left to lose." Elena's stomach twisted with a fear she'd thought, foolishly perhaps, she'd left behind on that terrace 6 months ago. "He's trying to start the war he couldn't finish. He's trying to hurt us, however he still can," Dante said, his jaw tight. A man who's lost everything doesn't simply disappear quietly, Elena. He becomes more dangerous, not less, because he no longer has anything left to protect except his own bitterness. What does this mean for us, for Matteo? Dante crossed the room and took her hands, his expression softening even as the tension remained coiled beneath the surface. It means I need to travel to Marseille with my father and several of our most trusted men to assess exactly how much damage Salvatore intends to do and whether it can be contained through negotiation before it escalates into something none of us want. It means the next several weeks may be tense, but it does not mean either of you are in danger. I have learned this past year exactly how dangerous it is to underestimate that man. I will not make that mistake twice. The 2 weeks Dante spent in Marseille were, for Elena, a return to a version of the fear she'd carried for a decade, but changed now, transformed by the fact that she was no longer facing it alone. Vittorio insisted she and Matteo stay at the Cassano estate under heavy security. Alessandro checked in daily. Even Marco, usually so quick to tease, called every evening with updates and gentle reassurance. "He's fine," Marco told her on the 8th night, his voice steady with the particular confidence of a man who had grown up watching his brother handle exactly this kind of crisis. Dante doesn't lose, Eleanor, not at this. He's spent his whole life becoming the kind of man who wins negotiations like this one. Trust him. She did trust him. That was, she realized, the profound difference between this fear and the fear that had driven her to flee a decade ago. This time, she wasn't facing an unknown threat alone with no one to turn to. This time, she had an entire family standing beside her and a husband whose competence in exactly this kind of dangerous world she had come slowly and completely to believe in. Dante returned on the 15th day, tired but victorious. Salvatore's attempt to sell information to the rival Marseille family had been intercepted and neutralized through a combination of financial pressure and, Elena suspected, threats she didn't ask him to detail. The rival family, unwilling to risk open conflict with the combined strength of the Cassano-Moretti alliance over information from a disgraced, universally distrusted source, had quietly withdrawn from the negotiation, leaving Salvatore stranded and, for the first time in the entire ordeal, genuinely, permanently powerless. "It's over," Dante told her that first night home, pulling her into his arms the moment he walked through the door, breathing her in like a man who had spent 2 weeks reminding himself, in quiet moments, exactly what he was fighting to protect. "He has nothing left to sell. No family will touch him now. Not after we made it clear exactly what dealing with him would cost them. He's finished, Elena. Truly finished this time." "And you?" she asked, searching his face for the toll the 2 weeks had taken. "Are you finished carrying this alone?" "I wasn't alone," he said, surprising her. "Not for one moment. I kept thinking of you, of Matteo, of everything I was fighting to come home to. That's not the same as carrying something alone. That's carrying it with a reason, with people waiting on the other side, worth fighting for." His forehead dropped to rest against hers, exhaustion and relief both evident in the gesture. "I missed you, both of you, more than I thought 2 weeks could possibly justify." "We missed you too," Elena said, and pulled him closer, grateful in that moment for a peace that felt, finally, earned rather than merely borrowed. A year after the wedding, on a warm evening in late spring, Elena sat on the terrace of the villa she and Dante had built for themselves on a stretch of coastline halfway between the Cassano and Moretti estates. A deliberate choice, Dante had told her when he'd first shown her the plans. A home that belonged to neither family's legacy alone, but to the new one they were building together. And watched Matteo, now 10, race his younger cousin across the lawn toward the pool with the shrieking, unrestrained joy of a childhood finally free of hidden dangers. "Papers came through today," Dante said, joining her with 2 glasses of wine, settling into the chair beside hers with the easy, unguarded contentment that had become, over the past year, so thoroughly familiar it was hard to remember the cold, controlled man who had first walked into the Cassano courtyard 14 months earlier. "Salvatore's final asset seizure. There's nothing left. The Commission's ruling stripped him of everything down to the last euro. He's living in a small apartment in Naples, apparently, doing consulting work for legitimate businesses that have no idea who he used to be." "Do you ever worry he'll try again?" Eleanor asked, though the question came without the sharp edge of fear it would have carried a year ago. More curiosity now than dread. "No," Dante said, with the certainty of a man who had spent the past year rebuilding an entire security apparatus around exactly this concern. "He has no allies left, no money, no leverage. Men like Salvatore only remain dangerous as long as someone believes there's still profit in dealing with them. That door is permanently closed now, across every territory that matters. He's a ghost story now, Elena, nothing more. A cautionary tale parents in this world will tell their children about the cost of betraying family for 30 pieces of silver." Elena let herself relax fully into that assurance, watching Matteo cannonball into the pool with a shriek of delight, his cousin following a half-second later, their laughter carrying bright and clear across the evening air. "I never thought I'd get here," she admitted quietly. "For 10 years, I genuinely believed this kind of peace wasn't possible for us. Not for Matteo, not for me, and certainly not with you. I built my entire understanding of the world around the belief that loving you had to mean constant danger." "And now?" Dante's hand found hers, his thumb tracing slow, familiar circles over her knuckles. "Now I understand that the danger was never you," she said. "It was always Salvatore, hiding behind a warm smile for 30 years, poisoning everything he touched. You were never the threat, Dante. You were always the person I should have trusted from the beginning, if fear hadn't gotten in the way first." "We can't change what fear cost us," Dante said, though his voice held no bitterness now, only the settled peace of a wound that had, finally, fully healed. "But I've stopped measuring our marriage against the years we lost. I measure it against the years we have left instead. And by that measure, Elena, I am the luckiest man alive." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their son play, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the sea, painting the sky in the same burning orange that had greeted Elena's return to Sicily over a year ago. A colour she had once associated with dread, and now, finally, associated only with home. "There's something else," Dante said eventually, and something in his voice made Elena turn to look at him fully, catching the nervous energy beneath his otherwise composed exterior, a rare enough sight after a year of marriage that it immediately caught her full attention. "What is it?" "The doctor called this morning. he said, and a slow, disbelieving smile began to spread across his face. Eleanor, we're going to have another baby. The wineglass nearly slipped from her fingers. What? You're pregnant. He was laughing now, pure and unguarded, pulling her into his arms with a joy so complete it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. We're having a baby, Eleanor, a sibling for Matteo, a child who will never, not for one single day, have to grow up not knowing their father, not carrying a secret that could get their mother killed. A child born into peace, for the first time in either of our family's history. Tears sprang instantly to Eleanor's eyes, happy tears, unburdened by the fear that had coloured every major moment of her life for the past decade. "Are you happy?" she asked, though the answer was written plainly across every line of his face. "I have never been happier about anything in my entire life," he said, and kissed her, slow and reverent, while across the lawn Matteo's laughter rang out clear and bright, utterly unaware that his family was about to grow by one more precious, hard-won life. The second baby, a girl born the following winter, whom they named Rosa after Dante's late mother, arrived on a night when the entire extended family had gathered at the villa for what was, by now, a nearly weekly occurrence, filling the house with noise and warmth and the particular chaotic love of two Mafia dynasties who had finally, fully, become one family instead of two wary allies. Elena watched Dante hold his newborn daughter for the first time, with an expression of such raw, unguarded wonder that she found herself crying again, not from fear this time, but from the sheer, overwhelming abundance of a happiness she had once believed entirely out of reach. "She has your eyes," Dante murmured, tracing one gentle finger along the baby's tiny cheek. "Thank God. One child with the Moretti curse is more than enough." "I happen to love that curse," Elena said, laughing through her tears, watching Matteo, 11 now, tall for his age, endlessly protective of the baby sister he'd been begging for since the pregnancy was announced, lean over the bed to get his first proper look at Rosa. "She's so small," Matteo said, awed. "Can I hold her?" "Carefully," Dante said, guiding his son's arms into position with the same gentle patience he brought to every moment with his children. And Elena watched her son cradle his baby sister with a tenderness that made her chest ache with pride, thinking of the decade she'd spent alone, terrified, never imagining she'd get to witness a moment like this one. Vittorio, standing near the door with Alessandro, watched the small family tableau with tears openly streaming down his weathered face. "2 grandchildren," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd live to see even one, cara, and now 2, born into a peace I genuinely believed our families would never achieve." "You have Dante to thank for that peace," Elena said, reaching for her father's hand. "And yourself, for trusting me enough to let this family rebuild itself, even after everything Salvatore tried to destroy." "I have you to thank," Vittorio corrected gently. "You were the one brave enough to run when you were 23, and brave enough to come back 10 years later and face everything you'd been running from. That courage is the reason any of us are standing in this room tonight. Later, Once the room had emptied, and the baby had finally settled into an exhausted sleep, Eleanor lay in bed beside Dante, Rosa's small bassinet positioned within arm's reach, and felt a peace so complete it was almost disorienting after a decade of vigilant fear. "Do you ever think about how different everything could have been?" she asked quietly, watching the gentle rise and fall of Rosa's chest in the dim light. "If Salvatore had succeeded 10 years ago, if I hadn't overheard that conversation, if we'd simply married as planned with that danger hanging over both our families—" "I try not to," Dante admitted. "The version of events where my father-in-law is murdered on our wedding day and our two families destroy each other in the resulting war isn't one I have any desire to dwell on, even hypothetically. I prefer to think about how remarkable it is that you were sharp enough at 23 to recognize danger when everyone around you was oblivious to it. That instinct saved your father's life, Elena, even if the decade it cost us both was almost unbearable." "I used to hate that instinct," she confessed.
"For years I resented myself for being the kind of person who couldn't simply trust the people I loved, who always assumed the worst possibility lurking beneath the surface. It felt like a curse sometimes, never being able to fully relax into happiness without waiting for it to be taken away." "And now?" Elena considered the question seriously, looking around the room, at their sleeping daughter, at the ring on her finger that had waited a decade to be given, at the man beside her who had loved her through every version of the mess their families had made and remained, unwaveringly, exactly where she needed him to be. "Now I think that instinct is part of why we survived long enough to build this," she said finally. "I don't regret being cautious, Dante. I only regret how much it cost us in years. But I've stopped hating the parts of myself that kept Matteo safe when I had no one else to trust. That version of me made this version of our life possible." "Then I owe her a great deal of gratitude," Dante said softly, pulling her closer against his chest. "That frightened, brilliant 23-year-old who ran into the night with nothing but instinct and courage. She saved all of us in the end, even if it took 10 years for the rest of us to catch up to what she already understood." Elena fell asleep that night, for the first time in over a decade, without a single thread of fear woven through her dreams. 5 years passed in the particular quiet, accumulating way that happiness does when it's no longer under constant threat. Birthdays and school plays and family dinners that stretched long into the evening. Matteo growing tall and thoughtful, increasingly curious about the family business in ways that made both his parents simultaneously proud and quietly apprehensive. Rosa turning into a fierce, opinionated child who adored her older brother with an intensity that made the entire extended family laugh. Vittorio passed peacefully in his sleep during Matteo's 16th year, surrounded by family, having lived to see both grandchildren grow well past the age of danger he had once feared he'd never witness. Elena grieved him deeply, but without the sharp, unresolved edges of a decade spent apart from him. Grateful, in the end, for the years of closeness they had managed to build after her return, years that had allowed her to properly know her father again before losing him for good. Alessandro, older now and increasingly content to hand off the operational weight of the family business to Dante and Marco, spent his remaining energy doting on his grandchildren, with the particular indulgent enthusiasm of a man who had spent decades too consumed by responsibility to fully enjoy his own children, and was determined not to repeat that mistake twice. And Salvatore Greco, true to Dante's prediction, faded entirely into irrelevance. A name occasionally mentioned in hushed, cautionary tones at family gatherings, a cautionary tale told to younger cousins about the cost of betraying blood for ambition, but never again a genuine threat to anyone Eleanor loved. It was on a warm evening during Matteo's final year of secondary school. The whole extended family gathered once again at the coastal villa for one of their now legendary Sunday dinners. That Elena found herself standing on the terrace where so much of her life had been decided, watching her son, nearly grown now, unmistakably his father's child in the sharp lines of his jaw and the particular controlled stillness he'd inherited, despite his mother's best efforts to raise him gentle, deep in conversation with Dante near the balustrade. "What are they discussing?" she asked Marco, who had wandered over with a glass of wine and the same easy grin he'd carried through 15 years of watching his older brother finally learn how to be happy. "University," Marco said. "Matteo wants to study architecture in Milan. Dante's trying very hard to be supportive about his son leaving home for the first time and doing an absolutely terrible job of hiding how much it's killing him." Elena laughed, watching Dante's carefully neutral expression as Matteo gestured animatedly about some architectural program he'd researched extensively, and felt her heart swell with a complicated tenderness. Pride in the young man her son had become, gratitude for the 15 years of ordinary, unthreatened childhood he'd been given after the decade of secrecy that preceded it, and a bittersweet awareness that the boy who had once hidden behind her skirt in a courtyard, uncertain of the world he'd just discovered, was now nearly a man, ready to build his own future, far from the shadow of either family's dangerous history. "He'll be wonderful," Elena said, crossing the terrace to join them, slipping her hand into Dante's as she arrived. "I know he will," Dante said, though his voice carried a thread of grief beneath the pride. "I just don't know how to let him go without feeling like I'm losing something irreplaceable." "You're not losing him," Elena said gently. "You're giving him exactly what we always wanted for him. A life where he gets to choose his own path, without fear, without inherited danger dictating every decision he makes. That's the whole point, Dante. That's what we built all of this for." Dante's arm came around her waist, drawing her close, and together they watched their son continue his animated explanation of some architectural theory neither of them fully understood, his face lit with an enthusiasm and freedom that neither of his parents had been permitted at his age. "Do you regret any of it?" Dante asked quietly, a question he'd asked variations of many times over the years, always needing, it seemed, some reassurance that the decade of pain had ultimately been worth its cost. "I regret the years we lost," Eleanor said, as she always did, honest even now. "I will always regret that. But I don't regret a single choice that led us here, to this exact moment, watching our son plan a future built on nothing but his own dreams instead of inherited fear. That future is the whole reason any of it was worth surviving." Rosa came barreling across the terrace then, 12 years old and full of the same fierce energy that had defined her since infancy, demanding her father's attention for some urgent matter involving her cousins and a disputed game of cards, and the moment of quiet reflection dissolved into the familiar, beloved chaos of family life, exactly as it should. On the morning Matteo left for Milan, the entire extended family gathered at the airstrip to see him off. An embarrassment of relatives, he complained good-naturedly, entirely unnecessary for a flight to mainland Italy that would take less than 2 hours.
But Elena noticed he hugged every single one of them anyway, lingering a little longer with his grandfather, Alessandro, whose eyes were suspiciously bright throughout the entire farewell. "Call your mother every week," Dante told him, gripping his son's shoulders with the particular fierce tenderness of a father who had once been robbed of 9 years with this exact child, and had spent every day since determined never to take a single moment for granted. "Not text, call. She worries." "I know, Papa." Matteo's grin was pure Elena, warm and a little mischievous, though his eyes were unmistakably his father's, storm grey and steady. "I'll call, I promise." "And if anyone ever gives you trouble," Dante added, lowering his voice slightly, though Elena caught the words anyway, "you call me, not the police, me." "Dante," Elena's voice carried a warning edge, though she was smiling despite herself. "I'm not suggesting anything untoward," Dante said, entirely unrepentant. "I'm simply saying that my son should know he has resources available to him that most university students don't. That's not a threat to society. That's parenting." Matteo laughed, hugging his father one last time, and then turned to Elena, and for a moment, watching her son's face, grown now, ready to step into a future entirely his own, Elena felt the whole arc of the past 16 years compress into a single, overwhelming wave of emotion. The terrified 23-year-old fleeing into the night, the exhausted single mother building an entire hidden life in Boston, the frightened woman standing in a Sicilian courtyard watching her secret finally, unavoidably come to light. And now, finally, this. A mother watching her son leave for university with nothing but excitement and possibility ahead of him. No danger shadowing his departure, no secret weighing down his future. "I'm so proud of you," she told him, cupping his face in both hands the way she had 1,000 times since he was small. "Whatever you build in Milan, whatever life you choose, I want you to know that everything I did, every hard choice I made when you were small, all of it was so that you could have exactly this moment, a future that belongs entirely to you." "I know, Mum." Matteo's voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. "I've always known, even before I understood the whole story. You gave up everything to keep me safe. I don't think I'll ever be able to properly thank you for that." "You don't have to thank me," Elena said, tears finally spilling over despite her best efforts to hold them back. "Just go build something wonderful. That's all the thanks I need." He hugged her tightly, then pulled back, glancing between his parents with a small, knowing smile that reminded Elena, achingly, of exactly how perceptive he'd always been, even as a small child, sensing tension he couldn't name in a Sicilian courtyard. "Take care of each other," he said. "I mean it. Don't just take care of Rosa and forget you're supposed to still be dating, or whatever it is you two do." "We are not, in fact, still dating," Dante said dryly. "We are married, extensively, for 16 years. "You know what I mean," Matteo said, laughing. And then, with one last wave to the assembled crowd of aunts and uncles and cousins, he boarded the plane, and Elena watched him go with a heart that ached in the particular, bitter-sweet way that only a mother's heart can ache. Grief and pride and overwhelming love, all tangled together into something too large for words. Dante's arm slid around her waist as the plane began its taxi down the runway, and she leaned into him, letting the weight of 16 years of marriage, of healed grief, of a love that had survived betrayal and separation and had come out the other side stronger for having been tested so completely, settle over her like something solid and permanent and entirely, finally, safe. "We did good," Dante murmured against her hair, watching the plane lift off into the clear morning sky, carrying their son toward a future neither of them could have imagined possible on the terrified night 17 years ago, when Elena had fled into the darkness with nothing but instinct and a secret she would carry alone for a decade. "We did," Elena agreed, turning in his arms to look up at the man she had run from and, against every fear that had once seemed insurmountable, found her way back to completely. "The ring you never got to give me all those years ago. I think it turned out to be worth the wait." Dante's smile, when it came, held all the warmth of a decade's patient hope, finally, fully rewarded. "Everything worth having usually is," he said, and kissed her, beneath the wide Sicilian sky, exactly where their story had always been meant to end. Not with the wedding that never happened, but with the family they had built anyway, against every obstacle a decade of danger and secrets had thrown between them. Standing together, finally, completely whole.